Good day, everyone. Welcome to our workshop on the strategic role of data in advancing a more circular economy for metals in the automotive sector supply chain, which is an event that is part of the Circular Economy Solutions Series Circular Mining and Metals workstream, and it's taking place on the sidelines of the Industrial Circular Economy Conference. The Circular Economy Solutions Series is a collaboration between Circular Economy Leadership Canada, formerly the Coalition, and Globe Series, where we have 6 work streams underway at the moment focused on accelerating the circular economy transition across key sectors in Canada and North America more broadly. My name is Paul Shorthouse. I'm the Managing Director of CELC and of the Circular Economy Solutions Series, and also a Senior Director with Globe Series and the Delphi Group, leading our green and circular economy work across Canada. I'd like to start by thanking our supporting partners, our sponsors for today's workshop, including the Province of British Columbia and the Ministry of Energy, Mines and Low Carbon Innovation, Smart Prosperity Institute, Metal Tech Alley, BCIT, and the Materials Efficiency Research Group. Next slide. Thank you. Before we kick it off, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm very fortunate to participate today from the unceded territory of Lekwungen peoples in Victoria, BC. We also want to acknowledge that attendees are joining us from the traditional lands of Indigenous peoples from across Canada, but also a very large number of international participants from around the world. So a very warm welcome to everybody on the line today. We're pleased with the strong and diverse interest in this topic. We had over 170 people register for today's workshop, including people from many different countries, from mining companies, from manufacturers, from technology developers, from governments, and from not-for-profits and a range of others. I'd like to just kick it off and invite each of you to get flexing that interactivity muscle by putting your names and organizations into the chat box if you can. Wonderful. Today's workshop will build on a series of events and initiatives that were jointly convened by CELC, by Merge, and by Smart Prosperity Institute, and supported by a range of other partners over the past year, which has really helped to identify the urgency of this topic for today's discussion. This includes the WCEF 2020 online side event on mining for circularity that was held last October on the sidelines of the World Circular Economy Forum. An online forum on mining and metals in the circular economy supported by Natural Resources Canada from earlier this year in March, and an ongoing project that's advancing new work on the role of primary material producing economies in a circular economy supported by SHREC, a grant program here in Canada, and the United Nations Environment Program. Before we get too far into it, I'd like to know a little bit more about our audience for today's workshop by asking you to take this quick poll that you should see pop up on your screen. I'd like to know what sectors you're joining us from and across the areas that you work. So take a moment to fill that in. And while you're doing that, we go to the next slide. I'm going to walk us through today's agenda that you can see here. Wonderful. So this virtual workshop will be very interactive in nature. So thank you very much for signing up to participate. Over the next 2.5 hours, we're going to dig into the topic of this, the importance of data and traceability in the mining and metals sector. And we'll be using the automotive sector as a bit of a case study, but obviously realizing that the insights that we'll be getting out of this workshop will be relevant to multiple sectors and value chains. Next slide. Over the first 1.5 hours, we'll hear from expert speakers across 3 topic areas that will help to set us up for the discussions during our breakouts. And we have a really great lineup of speakers today. I'm not going to introduce them all right now, but we will get to that just momentarily. We do encourage you to add your comments and questions into the chat box throughout the event. So please be sure that when you're sending your questions, you select all panelists and attendees so that everyone can see your questions. And we'll be monitoring these throughout, and we'll do our best to pick a few and provide suggestions or questions as they arise to the group. Following the speaker presentations, we'll roll up our sleeves as part of 35-minute interactive breakout discussions on 3 topics: policy options for enabling performance and tracing, the second one on technical and research needs for increasing the strategic use of data in the minerals and metals sector, and thirdly, market drivers and barriers for wider adoption of tracing systems. After that, we'll come back into full plenary for a brief report back before wrapping up. So in addition to the breakout room discussions in the chat box, we are going to be using a couple of additional tools to help gather input from you throughout this workshop. You'll see after each speaker panel, we'll be generating some polling questions that will appear on your screen that allow you to vote, and we welcome your input through that. In addition, we're going to be setting up, we've set up, I should say, a virtual Miro whiteboard that will allow you to provide ideas and input throughout this event. So I might just ask right now, Globe team, to share the link to our virtual whiteboard space with you now in the chat box. And what you'll see is when you click on that link in the chat, you'll see a web page pop up. It's a Miro board where you can input your thoughts on priorities, on challenges, on best practices across the 3 key areas that we're looking at today: market tools, policy, and technology. And so to add your thoughts on the Miro board, you can click anywhere. You can click any of the white post-it notes that you'll see and begin typing. You can resize those and drag them into the area of the board that you'd like. At the end of the event, we'll also prompt you to share what you think we need to do using sort of the space to the right. So if you're having any trouble controlling the board, you can use the sort of zoom in and out buttons on the bottom right of your screen, the plus and minus signs, as well as the hand tool that you can find by clicking on the mouse icon on the left toolbar. We've got staff that'll be in that space to help out as well. So this is, again, trying to encourage the interactivity, and we'll be keeping that whiteboard open throughout this event. So encourage you to keep adding any insights or thoughts that you'd like to share throughout that process. So without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Alan Young with Merge, who will introduce our first lineup of speakers as part of our context setting panel. We go to the next slide, thanks. Over to you, Alan.
Thank you very much, Paul. Can you hear me all right?
We can.
Okay, great. Welcome everyone, and again, it's really interesting and gratifying to see how quickly we attracted the attention of such a broad range of people who are touching on this important issue around data and this growing interest around data from the different perspectives. It is, again, sort of, we're going to be looking at market-related issues. We're going to be looking at technology and technical issues, as well as the policy issues that all are integral to successful use of data to accelerate the responsible and circular supply chains. As Paul mentioned, we're looking at the automotive sector as one case study because of the wide range and high volumes of minerals they use, and also because they've taken such a strong interest in circularity and on environmental and social governance issues. But that said, we're also seeing strong interest from electronics, from green energy, and even governments in need of verifiable and circular sourced minerals. So we shouldn't feel too slavishly preoccupied with automotive, because I think there's lots to learn from different sectors as well who touch on the use of mined materials. But yes, data itself may seem a bit obscure, but it is increasingly being recognized as an essential strategic asset and a tool for managing traceability and transparency throughout responsible and circular supply chains. So, and this is becoming ever more important as critical materials for things like EV batteries, as well as other parts of the green energy infrastructure, become increased in volume in terms of the demands and the efforts that it's going to take with both primary and secondary materials to get to that, the kinds of demands that we need to meet our Paris Agreement goals, among other needs. So today, we want to find out a little bit more about what's driving these trends and how they are affecting supply chains from different angles. We're very fortunate to have some leaders here from a range of businesses that are at the center of this set of issues and demands and changes. We've got JJ Messner de la Tour, who is a senior program manager for responsible sourcing of raw materials in Microsoft's devices supply chain. Ferdinand Geckler, who is a senior expert supply chain management in the BMW group. Malcolm Shang, who is a global mine closure and reclamation specialist and circular economy champion with ArcelorMittal Mining, and Arcelor also happens to be the largest steel producer in the world. And Amy Boulanger, who is the executive director of the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance, is working on a multi-sectoral group that is looking at third-party verified standards affecting the use of mined materials. So we have about 15 minutes, so this will be a teaser introductory session, but I want to get at a couple of things, and I'm going to ask each of you to answer 2 questions in sequence. I'll go on the first one, get answers from each of you, and then I'll go to the second one. The first question is just, why are traceability and transparency of minerals important to your businesses? And within that, what do you hope to gain from a business perspective on the effective use of data throughout your operations and supply chain? So basically, what are the drivers and what's the values of doing this? And so I will start with Malcolm, and as one of the primary resource extractors and users and manufacturers as well.
Thank you very much, Alan. Thank you for having me and being part of this this panel. So I think from my perspective, the biggest sort of benefit from more, I guess, transparent and traceable sort of value, provider in terms of minerals in the value chain. It's really about essentially having a competitive advantage and being a preferred supplier of, in inverted commas, more green, responsibly sourced materials. We're seeing it from different customers along our value chain in terms of them having a preference for these types of, metrics in terms of proof that it's been responsibly sourced, which really shows a shift in customer sentiment, even from their customers in terms of preferred suppliers of responsibly resourced materials. In terms of data and the uses, it really helps us our operations be more efficient and therefore allocate capital better. So I think there's benefits from both customers as well as just using our resources better internally.
Thank you, Malcolm. JJ, I'm going to go to you because Microsoft has been an early champion on environmental, social, and governance, and also on full recovery of metals from a variety of perspectives. As the figure often comes up like 40 metal in your average sort of computer and electronic device. So what does this mean for Microsoft in managing these issues?
Well, Alan, I'm pleased that you asked at the beginning about values, and Malcolm, you mentioned competitive advantage, because I think those two are fairly key points. Because ultimately, from our point of view as a manufacturer and a consumer products manufacturer in particular, our customers need to be able to trust in the integrity of our products. And when a customer buys a Surface laptop or an Xbox, they need to be able to do so knowing that the materials that went into building it were responsibly sourced. And I think that we've come a long way in collectively in the industry mapping our supply chains, but there are gaps that still remain. We do need to improve the visibility of our supply chains as an industry. But at the same time, I think one word of caution I would add is I think we need to be deliberate and intentional about the data that we do collect, and not just collect it for the sake of collecting it. But I think with more complete data, we do gain greater visibility, and with the visibility that we gain, we do gain greater trust. And I think that really comes to, again, the values and also the competitive advantage.
Great, thank you. I think I'll go to Ferdinand Geckler, who is joining us by phone from Germany. Thanks, Ferdinand. BMW is a very strong leader in this field and bringing a lot of the automotive sector along with it. Your thoughts on the way that data can contribute to your goals, both from a responsible and circular sourcing perspective?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah, you're a little faint, so speak up, but it's clear.
It's clear, perfect. So I'm so sorry for joining the meeting via phone. But yeah, to start with these two, I think, important issues. So why is data and traceability and transparency so important for us as BMW. So we as BMW are, I would say, pioneer in sustainability in terms of sustainable mobility. So in 2013, we've launched our first product, so the BMW i3. For this product, we did a lot of, let's say, supply chain mapping, and we also have a lot of parts in that car that are produced with secondary materials, so secondary steel, secondary aluminum, and secondary plastics. And at that time, so it took us many time to just map the chains and to, let's say, get traceability and transparency. And because we now want to do it with our full product portfolio, it's absolutely necessary that we use, therefore, intelligent systems to, let's say, at the end, get traceability, traceable and transparent supply chains, let's say, without picking up the phone and talking to each of the suppliers to get the connection. And therefore, at the moment, we are having two different projects that we're focusing on. The first one is still existing system, which is called IMDS. It's a system for the automotive industry where all the, let's say, relationships and connections of the supplier network, or at least 60% of it, is still in the system. But unfortunately, there is a, let's say, a contract in that system where we are not allowed to get that traceability, and therefore we are implementing a second system which is called Catena X. And so with this system, hopefully we can get easily traceable and transparent supply chains to get or to offer more sustainable products to our customers, like the BMW i3.
Great. Well, and Ferdinand's going to come back with us at a later, at the third panel, to talk about the role of secondary materials, recycled materials, and how they're envisioning the reuse of materials, repurposing of materials as part of that whole circular supply. Amy, going to you, you play a unique role. You bringing a bunch of different stakeholders from throughout the supply chain together to build an assurance system. Can you talk about the role that data plays for you strategically in providing that system?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Alan and others. I mean, it's so great to be able to follow Malcolm and JJ and Ferdinand in this space, because as you said, IRMA's standard to drive greater environmental and social responsibility where mining happens and throughout the mining supply chain down to the end customer is created through a multi-stakeholder accountability. So it's governed by mining companies, and then those who purchase from them, like Microsoft or like BMW, by NGOs, mining affected communities, and labor unions. But to make those connections work, you need the connections in the chain. As Malcolm said, if his company makes this effort for greater environmental and social responsibility at the mine level, and JJ and Ferdinand are valuing that as BMW and Microsoft, well, we've got to make that connection clearer. And for most cases, it hasn't been that clear. Most end consumers don't have their supply chains mapped. These are complex supply chains. There are a set of technological reasons why that hasn't happened. The market hasn't valued it before, but also things like when we hear from Anne Claire Howard with Responsible Steel later, lots of materials flow into processing points that are dealing with big volume. So it creates complications to the simple formula of, hey, the buyer with their purchasing dollars can leverage performance of their customer, right, of their supplier, because that supplier and customer is more complicated. We need to detangle some of that complication in order to create value, and in order also to create accountability. For NGOs and labor unions and mining affected communities, they want to know where these things are coming from so that they can reach to those where both harm is being done to reduce harm and also to create value for those investing in doing better.
Great. Well, thanks. And it's a good segue to the second part of our questions. And thanks for everyone for your concise answers there, because we still have 15 minutes, if I'm correct, Tansy, to answer both the questions coming in from the audience and then, but the other question that we have and what we're trying to get at as part of this forum is, what are the challenges? What do you see as the primary challenges that you're facing at the moment in sort of completing the objective for full traceability and transparency? What's getting in the way? Are they technical issues? Are they policy issues? Are they investment issues? Anything that comes to mind in terms of areas of strategic focus to really improve the way that data can help us move to a more, full circular economy? So I'll go through the same order and start with you, Malcolm.
Sure.
What do you use the key barriers and or challenges?
So I think in my opinion, I mean, there's a lot of data out there, and I think one of the other panelists mentioned it. It's really about trying to be strategic and defining what data is actually important. And then the other step, which I think is very, very critical, is actually verifying that data and certifying it so that the public and other customers actually have confidence in that data. And that's really where Amy and her organization comes in. I think there's been a lot of, I guess, ways to measure and show that you are a responsible provider and producer. However, there hasn't been a globally standardized way of doing it as much as far as I know, for a long time. And I think that's really what's needed. And you really need a lot of companies to sort of buy in. So I'm glad to see that there's more participation in the likes of IRMA that essentially creates a more globalized, standardized way of certifying that materials are produced in a responsible way. From the technology side, like I said, there's a lot of data being captured. It's really about defining what data is actually important and being selective in terms of actually identifying that, clearly defining it so companies can actually make a plan to actually measure it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and certainly two things on that. One is we'll hear in our final session from Jerome, who's working with the government of Luxembourg on a sort of a circular economy data consolidation and standardization, which I think will be a really interesting initiative, and how these things can work together with systems like IRMA to provide that consistency. And I guess bringing one end of the supply chain's needs to the other end of the supply chain's capacity and making sure those are aligned. So that's great. JJ, your thoughts on key challenges from Microsoft's perspective?
Yeah, I'm glad that Amy brought up a moment ago the issue of connections, because that is a real issue for downstream purchasers, our proximity to the actual entities who are sourcing the minerals, and our ability to, some people may expect that we might be able to control that, but it's really more an influencing relationship that sort of underlies all this. But I think beyond that, there are some structural issues, things like the cost of due diligence, where the burden of that diligence rests, how consistent due diligence is in various places around the world between different mineral supply chains. But also, I think asking how we build value of due diligence so that it becomes meaningful for affected communities as much as it does for the downstream who are asking for it. Who is this data actually for, and who is it going to benefit in the long run? I think another issue is, of course, infrastructure, and Malcolm talked a little bit about that. I think that the infrastructure for tracing like conflict minerals, for example, is quite mature now, but there is still a lot of work to be done, particularly tracing all minerals to the mine site, and that then allowing the downstream and other actors within the supply chain to be, I think, a little bit more targeted with ESG expectations. But just one thing I would return to is, again, avoiding collecting data for the sake of collecting data. We really need to be mindful and intentional about who it's going to benefit, because we have to remember that although due diligence is critical, it really does only address the symptoms and not the causes. Traceability is important, but once the minerals are mined, the impacts have already occurred. And so I think that we have to, focus our efforts on how we improve ESG standards at the mine site. And I think that that is why standards like IRMA are so important. It becomes proactive rather than retrospective. And that, I think, will allow us to affect positive change at both ends of the value chain and of course, all the way along it.
Sorry. Being able to measure impacts is good. Being able to avoid impacts is even better. So it's how we use the data to what end to feed back into the whole system. And this is, again, coming back to the idea of circularity, where we're really trying to look at reducing the overall footprint. We know we're going to need more metals just to meet these demands, but how we use them, how we reduce the impacts associated with them is really the end goal. So that's helpful. Ferdinand, from you as a major automotive manufacturer, you touched on a few of the challenges. Do you want to expand on your sort of priorities or perhaps desires to see data used better, more efficiently, more effectively? By the way, if people have questions, I want to encourage you to put them in the chat box. I've got one or two there, but if you do have questions related to this context, challenges, and others, please feel free to do that, and we'll use the time we have to address them. But sorry, Ferdinand, go ahead.
Okay, no problem. So I think the biggest challenge that we have at the moment is to convince our not tier 1 suppliers, but end-tier suppliers to give us the traceability, yeah, from, let's say, the tier 1 supplier down to the mine. And of course, sometimes we have the possibility to act like a trader and do direct contracting with the mine, and we are pushing the mine hard, for example, to get certified against the IRMA standard. But then the challenge is to, let's say, follow the way from the mine to the tier 1 supplier. Yeah? And because of that, we need that data, that platform, and hopefully we will get this in 1.5 years with the Catena X. But the biggest challenge then is to convince all companies in between, which means in between the mine and our tier 1 supplier, to enter these important information into that system. So this is really maybe a new way to, let's say, advance the economic system that we have at the moment, because the economical system that we have is based on intransparency and no traceability. And because we have many traders in between, especially for raw materials, and with these traders, their business model is intransparency, and we have to convince them to be more transparent and allow us to get the traceability. So this is our biggest challenge at the moment, and hopefully we can solve it, because at the end we want to show to our customers that our products are based on raw materials which are certified against, for example, the IRMA standard.
Yes, great. Thank you. And that certainly it speaks to perhaps policy instruments, international as well as national policy instruments, that certainly when you look at the impact on conflict minerals, that was partly the market, but there were key elements, whether it's OECD or the Dodd-Frank or other things, where you started to see the role of government highlighting this. It's not just a government issue, but currently this is part of what we want to get at is, how do the different players complement each other in terms of the messages to the marketplace that this is what is expected of business. So I think that's good. There's also the question, which I'm sure will come up later, that is challenging, genuinely challenging, is around intellectual property issues and proprietary business things. When you're getting into design questions, some of this stuff may be, not always, but may be an issue of competitiveness that needs to be addressed. But I think that's often used as an excuse rather than an actual barrier. But Amy, your thoughts on that, and then we'll go to the we've got about 5 or 6 minutes left. We'll go to a couple of questions that are coming in.
Yeah, well, just picking up on where Ferdinand left off there, I agree that it's, there are so many actors in between the mine and the end brand who are so critical to bring in. And of course, those are the companies that many of us don't know their names, right? And they operate frequently at a much narrower profit margin than on either of the other ends. It's trickier for them to show that they're going to get a value by this. And so they're being told to go back and source. But to the extent that they're doing that diligence and knowing who their sources are, being more accountable to it, trying to convey, if they're being asked to segregate material, or are they catching part of that value in there, particularly when they're operating at tighter margins? I think that that's right, that there's a tricky point in there, and that bringing those processors, refiners, smelters, and traders into this so they see that value. I also think in some material chains, we're going to need to innovate beyond just simple traceability, because traceability and tracking does cost a lot of money. It's a very good thing for us to know where does our food come, our water, our power, and now our mined materials. But if we can help to raise market value for environmental and social responsibility at all sites, it becomes less important to know, did I get my tin and my phone from that mine in Indonesia or that mine in Indonesia? If we can sort of raise performance of all of those there, and in places like that, or with a material like that, where, a third of the world's tin comes from Indonesia, then, again, instead of putting all the money into how we walk material from point A to B, B to C, C to D, which was never the problem in the first place, it was like these key points along the chain, then maybe there are other ways than just pure tracking and tracing that can still get to this goal of environmental and social responsibility. So that innovation will be great as well.
That's great. Yeah, I always like to start each of the conversations with what problems are we really solving for here? And you just nailed it. And a couple of you have talked about that like, let's go to the root of this. And speaking of the root of this, I want to finish this up. We've got about 3 minutes left. Somebody was, the end goal is around circularity, is to bring the optimum use of metals once they come out of the ground. Very durable, very usable, very, and there's a lot of reasons they are key element within the circularity. And how much of the design and the work that you each are doing includes the recycling, and to what degree are the challenges around reuse and recycling central part of intelligent data? I'll leave it at that. We just got a few minutes, but Malcolm, I know you're in a very interesting organization that is in the center of steel production, which is one of the places that matters most on this. Your thoughts on that?
Sure, Alan. I think one thing I must just point out is I work specifically for the mining segment of ArcelorMittal, so I'm not too, I guess, knowledgeable right now in terms of the steel segment and the work they're doing. I do know that they're putting a lot of investments in that on that end. In terms of the mining side, we do look at essentially looking at now ways to how we can either minimize or reuse our waste that we produce. There's some mines within our operations that have very benign mine waste products that come out of it, and there may be an opportunity there to have more of a circularity loop in the system that we could create if we actually found some industrial partners that made it economically viable within that area. So it is something that we were looking at internally, essentially trying to look at ways to minimize and reuse specifically our tailings, which is such a challenge for the mining industry in general. And if we can do that, even if it's with a few of our mines, I think that would be a real big win. In terms of data, that's obviously would be important, especially with tailings. It's really about what the tailings is actually made up of. So better internal oversight in terms of understanding what our tailings is, and especially when our process changes, it will allow us to better understand how potentially we could use that tailings, or how it could feed into another system.
Yeah, that's really a critical point when understanding the whole mining and metals sector, that recycling is important, but there's a lot of internal industrial waste that, if managed correctly, can be part of that whole circularity. And I think that's often overlooked and is critically important. Just got 1 minute left. I'm going to go to JJ because we're going to hear from Ferdinand on the whole question of secondary materials. So I'll just finish up with JJ, just from electronics point of view. How big is the recycling in factoring into your design questions?
Rapidly, more and more. So Microsoft has made a commitment to produce a 100% recyclable Surface laptop by 2030. And obviously there's a lot that has to go into making that happen. And I think it's just helpful for me to maybe outline a few things that we really have to think about, because thinking in terms of the advanced chemistries and the advanced metals that we have to use for making a Surface laptop, for example, it's not just the metals, but it's also the grade, it's the purity, it's the quality, and those things that we have to factor in. We also have to ensure that there's infrastructure for take back and collection schemes for end products, and we have to incentivize consumers to actually return products into that loop. We also have to think about government regulations that regulate how recycled material is used and reused, and even how it crosses borders. But ultimately, we are mindful of how to design for recycling, thinking about how to differently design a laptop so that it still performs well, but we can more easily recover the materials at end of life. But I think that one key factor I would just throw in, and I don't want to throw in a wrench into the works here, as much as we are trying very hard to bring more recycled material into our products, let's not forget this is against the backdrop of rapidly increasing demand. And so I know this is a very rough number, but even if we were able to recover all the materials from 1 million laptops today, if we are producing 2 million laptops tomorrow, you can see that there is the gap in supply and demand. And that I think speaks to the fact that it's going to be difficult to fill that gap from recycled materials alone, as much as we try as an industry.
Absolutely. And this is sort of the inconvenient truth, if you will, and why we're all working to figure out how circularity can be defined, including both raw materials and others. That's just a fact. I see we're at time. Amy, do you have a one sentence IRMA perspective on this? And then I want to hand it over to our next panel.
Thanks, Alan. I was just going to say that we'll have to address valuing materials retrieval and recycling as well. I mean, there is a mining company I know who puts out more by volume from materials retrieval than they do from new extraction, but they don't talk about it a lot, because even though they know it would bring positive reputational value, they make a greater profit margin from new extraction. And that's largely because of subsidies built into new extraction, which are not built in to value the materials retrieval and recycling end of it. So if we want to do that as well, that we're going to have to adjust some of those things that are built to value the new mining over materials retrieval right now.
Great. Thanks very much. This was really great. Good kickoff, everyone. And it's interesting to hear the breadth of perspectives. I'm going to hand it over to Yakamine and to take us to our next panel.
Unmute. I think that's the most common phrase nowadays. I will do the next session, strategic data applications, rapid presentations, materials for mining. Thank you to the speakers. That's part of this session today. We really appreciate that. Before I introduce you to the speakers and the session, I want to do a quick poll. The question, where are the most significant obstacles to fully traceable minerals throughout supply chains? So your options are the lack of consistent standards for data use, lack of market demand, technical barriers to collection and tracking, and cost of data collection and management. It looks like we are, oh wow, okay. I was trying to figure out who's winning, but it's going crazy. Technical barriers to collection and tracing, looks like that's the one that's doing the most of it. The poll will still be running for a bit. In the meantime, I am going to introduce the presenters to you. First of all, what we're going to discuss in this section is we're going to focus on the use of data for circular economy and responsible sourcing from the mine side and as materials feed into upstream supply chains. What kinds of data is important to understand during the extraction phase, and how are these being made available to downstream users? Each presenter will make a presentation to be followed up by questions and answer sessions. You are welcome to add the questions in the chat box, and I will take it from there once all our presenters are done, and I will present it to them to answer. So our first presenter is Ian Hudson from Anglo American. Ian currently serves as the head of environment at world-leading mining and minerals company, Anglo American, who he joined in 2020. Ian leads a multidisciplinary team covering a broad range of areas, including biodiversity, carbon and energy, air quality and emissions, environmental, geochemistry and water quality, circular economy, and material stewardship. That's a lot of things. Previous to joining Anglo American, Ian worked in the energy sector in a range of leadership roles across operations and corporate functions, as well as time as a CEO in a private equity-backed technology business. Ian is a marine biologist by trade with a PhD in deep ocean ecology and has remained active in this space since his early work at the National Oceanography Center. Ian has served a variety of NGOs and conservation groups and currently serves as a board advisor to BCSS Mozambique. So Ian, my question to you is, and you have a 5-minute presentation for this, Anglo American is actively investigating a range of circular economy applications across its business units. What are some examples of data tracking systems that are being deployed to achieve strategic objectives around circular economy and responsible mining assurance? Does proprietary knowledge pose an issue for you?
Well, thanks, Jacqueline. I didn't realize the bio would sound so long when it gets written down in an email. So thanks for crunching through that one. Certainly have plenty of diverse things on my plate to keep me busy on a day-to-day basis, but pleased to be with you today to be talking about circular economy and the work that we're doing, you know, both within our business and within the value chain. So it's been really good this morning as well, or this afternoon, to hear from, you know, from some of our customers and partners in IRMA and BMW as well, in terms of what's going on in that space. So yeah, I just got one slide to share outside of this pretty picture of our circularity in action. And I wanted to set the context really in terms of the way that we look at circular economy inside Anglo American. So we've very much taken an operational view. So that's what's going on within, you know, within our own fence. What's the opportunities that we have to bring circularity into our operations, the way that we manage our resources, the way that we manage our materials, and ostensibly the way that we then drive a culture around effectively waste not being a word that we use in the company. So we want to start actually referring to materials as materials that might have a secondary or tertiary life, as opposed to just referring to those materials as waste. So I'll share some context on what we're doing operationally. And then the second lens for us, which is becoming more and more important, is then understanding where we sit within the value chains that we're in. You know, and in some cases we're multiple steps from an end consumer, and in some cases it might only be 1 or 2 steps. So we've been doing a lot of work to map where our materials are within those value chains that we're in, you know, and also to try to understand what influence we have both directly and indirectly in terms of what happens to those materials when they're within that value chain. That requires a different approach from a data and technology perspective than what we've been deploying at an operational level. And then I think more holistically is we're looking to create a circular culture within the company itself. And that's being driven by some technology-based initiatives as well that's trying to activate our employee base. And I'll share a couple of examples on that as well. So if we sort of turn to the operational side, you know, first of all, one of the things that we're deploying here in terms of a tool to help build that background data, and I think Michael mentioned some of that in the previous discussion, is we think about what are the mineral materials we have? Where are they within our operational assets? Where are they actually physically located? How much of them do we have? What's the mineralogy and the geochemical properties of those mineral materials that we have within maybe our tailings facilities, waste rock dump facilities, processed materials. And so we've been deploying a geospatial tool, spatial inventory modeling tool, that allows us to understand at any time on a geographical level what we have within those particular mineral deposits, where they are, and it's to try to form a basis of what options do we have to then transform those into something of value. So if we take something like waste rock, what options do we have to do something with that waste rock, to place that waste rock into additional value chains where it can add value? And that might be for commercial value, that might be for for social and community and community regional development value. But the idea is to start off by knowing what have we got, where have we got it, down to a very, very granular level. So that takes care of the spatial side of what's going on operationally. And then we also use that same platform to predict what material we're going to produce in the future. So this is all connected to our Voxel platform, and which some of you may have heard of, but it's our in-house data analytics platform that powers across a number of our different applications. So spatial inventory modeling, big tool for us in terms of gathering that data from an operational perspective. And if we turn to then the value chain, this is where we've been working with World Economic Forum on their mining metals blockchain initiative, MMBI, which some of you might be familiar with. The idea behind this consortium is to understand the role that blockchain can play to provide that transparency on a range of ESG data parameters. And the idea from that perspective, again, is to understand where our minerals are and our materials are at any point within that value chain, and for people within that value chain to be able to interrogate that information at any point through the cycle. So if there's an end consumer that wants to understand the carbon embedded within that product from mine, they want to understand the water footprint that was used to extract that material, they might want to understand our biodiversity footprint in terms of land impacted versus land offset or land managed. The idea is to create that ESG package and to have that flowing through the value chain on a blockchain solution, but very much driven around what is it that people want to know. So, for example, that blockchain tag might say this is from an IRMA certified mine like our Unki mine in Zimbabwe. And if they want to then track how that IRMA certified material flows through the value chain, they can. But if there's things that maybe are not measured and managed through, say, something like an IRMA standard, those other ESG information points might also be available. So we're exploring what blockchain can do, within that space. And then the last one is sort of what are we doing internally? So we've created an electronic platform that we've called Circulab, which is basically an electronic incubator where people can submit their ideas electronically from around the company. And the idea is to try to understand what circular opportunities we have and to get the employees engaged in those. We run a virtual Shark Tank platform around that where people can pitch their ideas. We connect them to business partners within the company. And the idea is that we bring those, those business plans to life, and we then fund those plans and we incubate them, and then we progress them as circular economy projects within the company. Some of the work in that space has yielded the ability for us to move some of our mineral residues into a fertilizer value chain. We're looking at mobilizing some of our waste rubber products into a waste rubber value chain that creates the same product again. And we're also working with some of our key suppliers, like a Michelin, for example, on how we actually never really dispose of a tire at all. It just runs through the system and has sort of 4 cycles around the value chain, as opposed to ending up in a tire dump like is the sort of current practice at the moment. So yeah, lots of different things happening. Happy to take questions at the end. Thanks.
Thank you for that, Ian. Next is Anne-Claire Howard from Responsible Steel. And apart from the fact that we all know that she's got a great red chair that she's sitting on, Claire was appointed as Responsible Steel's first CEO in March of 2021, joining from her previous role as Executive Director of Better Coal. She leads the steel industry's first global multi-stakeholder standard and certification initiative aimed at maximizing steel's contribution to a sustainable society. She's got a very great bio. I am going to end this with, she's been involved in oil, gas, mining projects and businesses in Africa, Asia, Middle East, and the Americas. So she's been everywhere. And Claire is a graduate of Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and Science Pro Paris. She's a member of the first cohort of the Franco-British Young Leaders Network and sits on the Coal Industry Advisory Board. So, Anne-Claire, my question that I have for you is, Responsible Steel is in the midst of establishing a system for certifying steel against a variety of sustainable development criteria for the mine site to the smelter. How are you using traceability to provide assurances of responsible practices throughout the steel supply chain?
Thanks, Jacqueline, for the very kind introduction. And if there's any questions on my chair, I can take them in the chat box later. Responsible steel, and it's been mentioned in the first panel, steel kind of sits in the middle of this whole value chain story, and as an industry is getting a lot of questions from its customers. And you could argue that, you know, when Amy was talking about pinch points in the middle of the supply chain, steel kind of sits in the middle. It's also absolutely central to the whole circular economy story, because steel is one of those materials which in an ideal world could be infinitely recycled and reused, and you could potentially one day hope to reach the stage where we don't need to produce virgin steel anymore, but that is a very long time away. So when it comes to sourcing responsible materials, steel faces a double challenge. It's got to identify the mining materials that it's using, but also scrap, which plays a significant role in the supply chain. I'm not going to delve into scrap too much because it's a very challenging topic, and there are a lot of many better experts than myself to tell you about the challenges around the responsible sourcing of scrap metal. But I will touch on the mine side because I think it's vitally important for us. So first of all, the question itself, which is around traceability, and there's a couple of points there that I want to put as a premise. First of all, traceability is not the panacea. It's not necessarily about tracing your materials. It's about understanding what materials are in your supply chain and ensuring that you're mitigating risk, but also improving the performance of the companies supplying you with a product. Then what kind of data are you looking for? I think it's been said in the previous panel, data is available. There's a plethora of data. It's what's the right kind of data and what is the purpose of that data and whom is it empowering and whom is it helping to actually get that data? Is it for customers to make informed choices? Is it for local communities to hold the companies that they work with accountable? There's a number of reasons that you have data and that data can be useful. So, and then there's how this data is collected and is it trustworthy? And again, that was mentioned previously, this importance of trusting the data that you receive. So for responsible steel, the aspect we're looking at, and this is about producing certified steel, so knowing that your bar of steel has been responsibly produced. When it comes to the mine materials, what we're doing is assessing reliable, credible third-party mining assurance schemes, such as IRMA, which is one of the schemes we're looking at, but also MAC-TSM in Canada and others across the globe. And the idea is really around, first of all, providing upstream supply chain visibility. So we ask steelmakers to know where their product comes from. And that's been touched upon by Ian. There are multiple solutions around blockchain traceability, the use of new technologies to do that. There's also materials where traceability might not be the issue. And I think Amy touched on that in her presentation. It's not necessarily about knowing where your product comes from. At the end of the day, is it really about suppliers, steel manufacturers, pinpointing that this iron ore came from this very specific mine somewhere? Is it not more about understanding that you're not exposed to unnecessary risks, or that you're mitigating with the suppliers the risk that they're facing as mining producers? And then there's the collection side of it, and making sure that as a steel producer, you know that you can trust the data that you're being given. And for that, it's really about that trust building and that third party assurance. And I think that that's one of the key criteria. Is certification is not ideal. It has its pros and cons, but it is about ensuring that we know the data that's being provided through traceability initiatives is actually accurate data, but not just static data. And I think that's a really important point. It's not data about performance today. It's also a data around is your performance going to improve through time? And that's why I think continuous improvement and data need to filter in together at some point. So for responsible steel, there's a double objective. It's getting the right data from the upstream part of the supply chain, but then for the steelmakers themselves to use that data added to their own challenges around the processing of steel, the greenhouse gas emitted during the processes, etc., and making sure that that whole data set is actually relevant for the end consumer. So it makes it a very challenging issue, and that's why we've decided to work with other initiatives as opposed to creating something new from scratch. We're going to try and build on what we're achieving with other initiatives that are doing the same. And I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Thank you. And Claire, yeah, I can see that being in the next level of the chain can have its own difficulties on that. Our next presenter is Ryan Foreman. Ryan is from the BC Provincial Government. Ryan is an executive member with the BC Public Service. He works for the Ministry of Energy, Mines and Low Carbon Innovation. Ryan leads a multidisciplinary team that includes policy development, intergovernmental relations, sustainable finance, digital delivery, and reporting for the ministry. Ryan has over 15 years experience with public service delivery focused on natural resource sector and is an expert in process improvement. Ryan has successfully driven multiple complex public-private projects in the mining, natural gas, and forestry sectors. Most recently, he's leading government efforts to establish an open source platform to track raw materials and ESG attributes for international operators. So Ryan, my question to you. BC is interested in demonstrating leadership as low carbon responsible materials producer. What is the government going to help companies and downstream buyers track the kinds of data that will assist them in better understanding the materials being extracted and produced in BC?
Good morning and thanks everyone. I'm joining you from Victoria, British Columbia today, and I just want to acknowledge the Lekwungen speaking people whose historic relationship with the land continues through today and express my gratitude to get to live, work, and play here in this beautiful territory. So we know that there is an increased global demand for responsibly sourced materials, and fundamentally believe that producers in BC have an advantage to be able to meet this demand. Our producers are already, meeting high regulatory standards. They're advanced in many areas related to responsible mining practices. In shaping a low carbon future, we have a government-wide initiative called Clean BC. This plan was developed as a pathway to achieve our climate targets and reduced emissions by the year 2030. The plan includes a variety of measures, incentive programs for industry, boosting energy solutions across our sectors, and it's intended to shape the low carbon economy and demonstrate our commitment as a leader in the transition to a global low carbon future. However, at the operational level, we know that regulatory data that supports industry performance and contribution to meeting global demands does not always get surfaced in a way that our industrial operations can really benefit from. So one question that we've asked is, what is the best and most effective way to surface this type of data? And a key initiative we're now exploring to answer this is through the Digital Trust Marketplace. And go to the next slide. Our agency is supporting an open source software initiative that provides self-service digital wallet tools for companies to prove the origins and characteristics of mineral resources. This will be a first of its kind. We're leveraging distributed ledgers that bring both public and private data sets together in a very trusted manner. These capabilities will be foundational to be able to track attributes like carbon intensity in a manner that is verifiable and will scale up to enable global carbon accounting. As an example, 98% of industrial operators in BC are hooked up to hydroelectricity. So fundamentally, we believe that just waking up in British Columbia, you have an edge when it comes to carbon intensity. Digital wallets for the business community are going to enable companies to begin taking back control of their ability to manage their information while providing a trusted exchange of data between governments, business partners, and customers. What I'll really want to hammer home on this presentation to various CEOs that are selecting solutions now is interoperability across solutions will be key to scale this globally. And go to the next slide. The goal here is to empower all members along the supply chain to request and share information needed to make decisions around sourcing and investment. We know there are many solutions regarding traceability and ESG disclosures starting to emerge. However, the majority of these are proprietary and focus on vertically integrated supply chains. The efforts have good intentions, but in terms of scaling globally and enabling your entire supply chain, it will be lacking. We believe that a centralized platform will just not be accessible enough to the world. This is why we've embarked on a journey to leverage open source solutions to allow an exchange amongst multiple parties, no matter the digital wallet you're using. This solution would be applicable to not only supply chain tracking, but also ESG related disclosures. We know that as a province, we are part of a very broad global solution and really see ourselves as a convener, given our interests at large across the province and beyond, and as a contributor of credentials from regulatory data sets. Our expectation is that others will gain visibility that BC operations are following responsible practices, and collectively this will allow us to step into a low carbon future more quickly. Go to the next slide. I like this image because it demonstrates what I'm talking about when I say public and private. So the number 2 there you can envision as a mining operator. Number 1 is would be a regulatory data such as a permit or BC business registration that would prove where your operations start, perhaps your GHG profile and emissions intensity, flowing into a centralized distributed ledger for one of our mining operators. The mining operator allowed to load proprietary data into this, and we're working with a variety of different auditing firms that also be able to load information into this wallet. This information then is fully owned in terms of trustworthiness and self-sovereign identity to the operation, and they can then provide it downstream to their next partners in their supply chain. I fundamentally, and I think you've heard in the previous slides, just as I say, want to challenge all of us in our thinking around the solutions that your organizations are choosing, looking to areas of open source to ensure we can sort of scale up globally. This really becomes also the beginning of global carbon accounting using distributed ledgers. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Ryan, for that. We have about 3 minutes left for Q&A session. Ian, I want to pose this question to you. Where is the question now? How do companies manage the additional cost of responsibly sourced materials? Are these offset by reduced liabilities or conflicts? And do they help gain market share or anything else that you can add to that?
I think that's the killer question, really, in terms of whether there is a perceived value, I guess the way we see it is that responsibility of how we, bring minerals into value chains is table stakes to some extent. And I think what you're likely to see is something that works more in the opposite direction, which is if you're not responsibly sourced, then expect a price discount. So to some extent, responsible sourcing, the provenance and the information and the data that you provide with your product is what enables you to stay at price parity, as opposed to dropping into a sub-tier market, where you might find a sub-tier product. So, I think that's genuinely, I'd love to think that the better that you can do, the higher the price of the material, but I just don't think that's the way the market's driving it at the moment. Supply and demand can do funny things, but ultimately I think it's about making sure that you stay in the game and that you're, a tier 1 supplier. As Ferdinand said, you want to be the preferred supplier into those preferred value chains. I think one of the things that we're also sort of thinking about on that front as well is you want to be exposed to those lower carbon value chains as well. So, when we look at the steel industry where Anglo is playing, that's a real challenge, to be able to understand which of those steel value chains are going to be the lower carbon value chains. That not everybody's going to be able to play in, say, DRI hydrogen-based steel. So I think that there's a lot to be said in terms of how you expose yourself to those value chains, but what size they will be and the demand for those materials within those value chains, to some extent is still to be written.
And do you have something to add for 1 minute?
So that's a lot of pressure, but yeah, I'll just echo Ian's sentiment, which I think, and with steel, it's going to be slightly different, I think, than mine materials, because I think there will be, at least for a short amount of time, a premium market for ultra low carbon steel, but which in my mind is different to responsibly produced steel, because you could be producing ultra low carbon steel from products that have been, sourced irresponsibly or have had a large impact further up the value chain. So I think that's why my kind of parting thoughts is really, yes, we're talking a lot about carbon emissions and data around carbon, but if we're talking about responsible sourcing and responsible production, we need to remember the rest of the ESG spectrum as well.
Thank you, Claire. I would like to thank Ian and Claire and Ryan for their contribution to this. And with that, I am going to hand this over to Jeff.
Okay, thank you, Jacqueline. And I'm just waiting until I think I'm supposed to wait till I pop up. There we go. Okay, I'm assuming everybody can hear me okay, or that it'll be flagged for me if you can't. Welcome to the third session. This session's on strategic data applications for secondary minerals, sorry. My name's Jeff McCarney. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Ottawa, and I'm also the director of research at the Smart Prosperity Institute. We're a national environment economy research network and think tank that's based here at the University of Ottawa. A key message, to introduce this session, a key message that's come from a lot of the recent research work that we've been doing and convening efforts that others that we've been working with, including CELC and the Material Efficiencies Research Group and others. Messages coming from this work is that circular economy is going to require incentives and actions on broader material solutions. Recent research that we've been undertaking, working with groups like the United Nations Environment Program and others, which we're going to be releasing shortly over the coming months, so stay tuned, suggests shifting to a circular economy while also meeting increasing demands for mineral resources from growth in emerging economies, increasing demand for electronics, and needs of a low carbon energy transition. For example, batteries in automotive and EVs will require integrating primary and secondary materials in increasingly circular value chains. As JJ hinted at earlier, even models with aggressive assumptions on secondary material production and recyclability, ramping up recyclability to 100%, which isn't going to happen immediately in the near future. But if you assume that, we still need primary materials for at least the medium term going forward, 40 to 60 years in a lot of markets, to meet demand projections. And a lot of circular economy incentives, whether that's driving a faster transition to a low carbon economy or increasing the lifespans of certain products and materials in use, will often delay that transition as well, as materials stay in use longer or we require more material for low carbon transition. So while the last session looked at circularity for primary materials, which is going to be important, this panel is accordingly going to focus on the other half of that problem, which is on the use of data to track and better utilize secondary minerals for deconstructing, recycling, and or reusing from existing products. Challenges in this respect range from initial product design to supply chain coordination issues, as well as the technical means to assess, trace, and integrate these minerals in a cost-effective manner. So to start off with, we're going to put up a poll here quickly. So I'll wait for Tansy to do that. And the poll question, if everybody wants to engage, is just what factors or opportunities come to mind for you when considering strategic data applications specifically for secondary materials? Thinking a bit differently from what we've been looking at so far. I'll leave the poll up on the screen for folks to respond. This will help us gauge where people's thinking are as we go through the panel. In the meantime, I'd like to take the chance just to introduce our panelists. I'm going to do this really briefly, given the timeframes that we have. Our first panelist is Sarah Hood, who is CEO of Propulsion Quebec. Our second, we met earlier today, is Ferdinand Geckler, who's Senior Expert Sustainable Supply Chain Management from BMW Group. And our third is Jerome Petrie, who leads the Circularity Dataset Standardization Initiative with the Ministry of Economy and the Government of Luxembourg. And his work was referenced earlier by Alan as well. So welcome to all our panelists. Just a quick reminder, we're trying to have we're using a discussion format here, trying to stay about 5 minutes in response time. I'm going to pose some questions to allow for Q&A. And for the audience, please, if you have questions, as we've been doing so far, feel free to enter them in the chat function at any point, and we'll pick up on those as we go and in the Q&A section at the end. Looks like our poll has made good progress, and opportunities for improved supply chain coordination, as well as material data assessment challenges around standardization and transparency are key issues, which is great. I think we're going to pick up on a lot of those with our speakers here. Okay, so I think first we're going to go to Sarah. So Sarah, thank you for joining us. I want to flag Propulsion Quebec is working with the Global Battery Alliance on a battery passport pilot project that would allow various actors in battery supply chains to understand the properties of each of the elements in batteries and their movements throughout supply chains. So I was going to ask up front, can you speak a bit to the kinds of values or other outcomes this pilot program is expected to generate? And where do you find partners from different stages of the supply chain are showing greatest interest in the work that you're doing?
Sure. Thank you for having me first. This affiliated pilot project we are running in Quebec focuses on one specific portion of the battery value chain, namely the mining, refining, and production of anode materials made of graphite. It is a partnership between us, Propulsion Quebec, the Quebec's Department of Natural Resources and Energy, Natural Resources Canada, Nouveau Monde Graphite, Optel Group, and CIREG, that's a research center based here in Montreal. The project entirely lies in the province of Quebec. It starts with the mining operations taking place at Nouveau Monde Graphite's Saint-Michel-des-Saints mine site, and it extends to purification stage in Bécancour, leading to the production of coated spherical purified graphite, a key product in the anode part of the most lithium-ion batteries. Sorry, the poll keeps on popping on my screen. So the core objective of the project is to implement traceability mechanism in order to demonstrate the value proposition of the battery passport as proposed by the Global Battery Alliance and its members. Such value proposition, we think, combines three main characteristics. The first one is data transparency, making sure that relevant data is collected and made available. The second one is data verifiability, making sure data is validated by independent third parties. And the third one is data traceability, making sure data is gathered at one stage of the value chain, follows the product at the next stage, and thus enabling stakeholders at the end of the value chain to have full information on the associated supply chain and not just on the final product. The battery passport provides distinct value to stakeholders in the value chain as it enables tracking a battery's ESG profile from mining of raw materials or their recycling to the production of cells and their final integration in an EV. In an electric vehicle. ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance. We all know that, meaning that a full range of information pertaining to those key aspects, for example, greenhouse gas emissions, water use, waste management, human rights, fair labor practices, progressive board composition, business ethics, community relations, First Nations, community work, etc., are collected at each stage of the value chain. Such traceability involves disclosing information so that not only do end users have information on the environmental footprint of their EV, which is, we think, and we see that in the news a lot, it's expected, but also all stakeholders along the value chain get information on their suppliers, thus influencing their procurement strategy to minimize their own footprint. Traceability thus enables some kinds of positive cascade effect, trickling effect, from one stage to the other, improving ESG compliance at each of them. To that regard, to achieve such positive impact along the value chain, the battery passport will be intentionally designed in a way that offers a distinct benefit to each stakeholder along the value chain via the data transparency provided. All downstream stakeholders, including battery and automotive original equipment manufacturers, receive verified information on the provenance of raw materials and proof of compliance with human rights and anti-corruption policies and environmental impact to enable sound procurement decisions. Additionally, the battery passport allows government and the public to independently scrutinize such information. Manufacturers can realize higher residual values via increased utilization of batteries and extend the life of batteries for EV purposes by with a reliable battery passport data. In addition to these economic benefits, the battery passport is a key enabler of a sustainable and circular battery value chain, and it provides detailed information not only on a battery ESG profile, but also on its chemistry and ultimately its recycled material content. As we've seen with the recently adopted European Battery Directive, governments will be more and more asking for information on the carbon footprint as well as recycled material content through some kind of battery passport. So traceability is, for us, the only way such important questions can be answered.
Okay, thank you very much. Really interesting overview of the work you're doing and right to time. So I appreciate that quite a bit. Next up, we had Ferdinand Geckler. Ferdinand, are you still on the phone?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, perfect. So I think what question I wanted to pose for you, picking up on some of your comments from earlier in the session, I appreciate you coming back on a second time, is BMW is developing a variety of systems to improve materials use efficiency and recovery that can contribute to a more circular economy for automobile construction. You alluded to a lot of these earlier. So for secondary materials in particular, though, what are some of the strategic or practical factors that are affecting their purchase and integration into your production chain? And where are some of the main barriers you're finding that you need to overcome?
So first, the system that I mentioned before, so Catena X, you can also use it, of course, to get traceability for secondary materials. So that means for open loop or closed loop material. And so I mentioned before that we, for example, in the BMW i3, we are using about 25% of secondary material. And so this car was launched 8 years ago. At the moment, we are fighting to use about 40% of secondary material. And so one of the biggest challenges regarding the use of secondary material is also technical restrictions and regulatory let's say, requirements regarding, for example, stability or quality of the material in terms of accidents. And because if you use a car, you can't use, at the moment, you can't use secondary material, for example, for the bumper or for other parts of the car. But of course, for interior materials, you can use secondary material. So this is one challenge that we are facing, and the other is that at the moment, if it comes to certain raw materials like copper, it's easy to have a closed loop. Easy means that the copper is in our car for more than at least 10 up to 20 years. So it's if we have it in our car, it still stays there for 20 years. And then, of course, if there is a closed loop, we have only one quality of copper. So for all the parts where we need copper. For other raw materials, for example, we have the problem that we have many different sorts of the materials. So just to give you an example, for plastics, we have more than 40 different sorts of plastic in our car. And if we do not, let's say, collect these plastics at the moment, so in a way that we have mono material, so we have problems later because the quality is getting poorer and poorer of the material if we do recycle it. And so in the future, we have to rethink the development of our cars to use more mono materials, which means that we maybe have only one or two sorts of plastic in our car. And therefore, we also have to convince, for example, the regulation. And of course, we have to do a lot of testing to find the right let's say, way of plastic we use inside the car, for example, and the right way of secondary material. So it's depending on each raw material, we have different challenges, and depending on which part of the car we need these raw materials, we also have these regulatory challenges at the moment.
Okay, thank you very much. And really interesting and connects to some of the discussions we've had as well and leads well into our next speaker, Jerome, who can speak to some of the standardization initiatives they're undertaking towards materials and data. So Jerome, I wanted to ask, the Circularity Dataset Standardization Initiative was established to address the issue that circular economy data tracking is vitally important, but also expensive, difficult, and non-standardized throughout the existing economy. Are there challenges specific to standardization of data for secondary materials data in particular that you've encountered? And can you describe one or two key successes or highlight any prominent challenges that could benefit from increased policy or research focus?
Hi, Jeff. Yes, of course. So during the analysis we have clearly identified several showstoppers to get the correct standardized circular properties on products or even secondary materials. So we see it's today quite difficult to go up the supply chain to get all this data you need to reuse or reloop your products in a new circular business model. Also, all the different suppliers in that whole value chain have different understanding of all the terms and definitions which are used or asked in all the different schemes we're asking for data. So, and also there are so many different schemes out there, and most of them which are on the market are very sector specific. So for base material supplier, it is a really huge effort to be made to respond to all these systems to collect this data. And as Ferdinand mentioned, of all these plastics used in a car, you can imagine that the plastic manufacturer has many different customers going in many different sectors. So for them, it's really complicated to get all the data needed, and really is asking a lot of efforts and money to do that. And then further to this, many producers are really reluctant or even unwilling to share some sensitive data, which they would consider trade secrets or even proprietary data. So in order to tackle all these issues, we have developed a detailed data template called the Product Circularity Datasheet, abbreviated PCDS, to make sure that people are reporting the exact and necessary circular properties on their products. The data template starts at the very beginning of the supply chain, so it's intended also directly from the base material manufacturer or the secondary material provider. And after it's filled out, it's given on to the next customer who is filling it out for himself. He's aggregating the different PCDS he gets from his suppliers, adding the effect of his process, and he's providing it to his next customer, and so forth until we end up to the last producer. An interesting part is that the question I asked in a way that it's not sector specific. So we wanted to do it really that it's not looking at what is the application of the product. So these are really generic questions. And of course, we are trying to use clear terms and definitions based as far as possible on existing standard norms and regulation to make sure that people are really speaking the same language throughout the whole value chain. And also to overcome the fact that some producers are reluctant to provide data, which shows a very specific solution, and the data template is in fact based on true-false statements. So the PCDS comes along with a guidance document which explains you how to answer to these true-false statements, and also how to relate and keep a record of the proof which supports a specific statement. And to finalize this, we are developing an open and international standard which will make it possible to audit this proofs and data by a third-party auditing. So I think that's very important to provide trust in the tool and make sure that people are using it throughout the value chain. So with that whole PCDS ecosystem, we believe that we can provide a simple solution to all these issues, providing circular properties on products. Also, it will save a lot of money to the suppliers and the customer to provide the data and fill out the data and use the data. And in the end, it will promote many new circular business models and also encourage producers to improve their product design to enable more circular properties. What we're doing here is also fitting well with many requirements which are being put out there for a digital product passport. And we believe that with the PCDS, we will easily support the upstream input of circular data in such product-related data templates.
Okay, thank you, Jerome. And everybody stayed right on time, so I appreciate that. And it gives us time to do a quick follow-up, I think, before we go to Q&A. So I know there's one question there, but if others have questions, please add them in and we'll pick them up at this point. But I might come back to all the panelists first, maybe in the same order with sort of a general follow-up, which I think relates to, we've heard about the importance of data accessibility and the constraints that proprietary data put on understanding secondary material use. Importance of product design and the quality of materials coming in and how regulatory and performance constraints can affect secondary material markets. What needs to be done to help support these kinds of initiatives, particularly as it pertains to the use or availability of data or how you can integrate it into your decision making? I think that sort of picks up on a range, but I'll go back in the same order. So starting with Sarah and then Ferdinand, if you have anything to add, and finally Jerome. So Sarah, to you. No, I believe you're still muted.
My God, still happening. Sorry for that. So first and foremost, more initiatives like this GBA affiliated pilot project are needed at other stages of the battery value chain. For example, at cathode manufacturing, cell manufacturing, etc. Also, the aforementioned EU Batteries Directive is most certainly the best example of what needs to be done in order to promote global adoption of traceability in the battery value chain in other countries, territories, or states. Similarly, carbon border adjustment mechanisms, such as those projected in both Europe and USA, are also interesting initiatives, but their limitation is that they only focus on carbon footprint and not more globally on ESG aspects. Such regulations and initiatives do not only push on the stakeholders along the value chain, but to gather information on the ESG profile of their activities and products. But it also pushes them to share that information and make sure that it was audited through a renowned due diligence processes, so that the information is not only available, but also validated by accredited independent third parties. Oh, now it's your turn.
My turn. Thank you, Sarah. And Ferdinand, over to you. Do you have anything to add? Are you still there, or are you possibly muted now? Okay, I'm not hearing Ferdinand. So maybe Jerome, if you have anything to add, and then we
can you hear me?
Oh, so, now we have you. There we go.
Okay, so I had some problems with my connection. Could you please repeat your question?
Yeah, with the issues that were raised through the opening comments regarding the proprietary data and accessing that to understand the quality of secondary materials, design and recyclability of materials through supply chain. What are some of the what needs to be done in your view that can help support initiatives around improving secondary materials data, particularly as it pertains to the use or availability of data and how you can integrate those materials?
Yes, so I think the first thing is that we have to, and this is what we are doing at BMW, we design for recycling. So that means that you have to rethink your so the production and the parts and the materials that you use for your cars. So you have to reduce the number of different raw materials in the car as much as you can. And then you have to start with a design for recycling. And this is what we are doing now for many years. And but we have to, I think, drastically speed up with that. And the second thing is if you can offer, let's say, I call it a circular car, what you also need is you need a system or a data system that gives you that traceability, again, what I mentioned before, because at the end, in an ideal way, you have a really close loop, so that maybe BMW, a circular BMW, in 2030 or 2040 can become 20 years after again a new BMW, without using any additional material. And this is, I think, what we will do next is we will source more in not closed loop, but open loop, which means that we use, for example, plastic or PET bottles that we are still using in our car for interior and also for the seats, for example, in our cars. So that the garment is made of recycled plastic bottles, for example. So this is what we do at the moment, but at the end, and the vision that we have is that we have a real closed loop, so that we use 100% of the raw materials to produce exactly the same car or another car in the future.
Very interesting. Thank you very much. Jerome, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, sure. I think I would add just 3 short words. And for me, what is very important in all this is, first is trust. Second is security in the data you are exchanging, and also the quality of the data you are exchanging. So these are very important items we have also identified, and I think people can connect to that quite easily. So if you don't have these 3 pillars on what you're doing, you will most likely not succeed in gathering the correct information, the full information, have a trustworthy partnership with the people you want to exchange with, and and then also the security. You want to make sure that your value chain is not disclosed to anybody else. You don't want the competition to gain access to some part of the information, but still you need to have some communication channels to exchange with the person who really need that. So these are, I would say, 3 simple words, but really showing the big challenges which are behind that.
Thank you very much. Okay, we've got about 3 minutes left and a few questions. I'm going to take the first one and send, and maybe I'm going to pose it to Ferdinand. Maybe he has more direct insights, but then come to Sarah or Jerome if they have anything to add, or any last thoughts if we're coming to the end of the time. It's from Bruce Dudley, and he asks, can higher performing metals and minerals realize greater value if commodity markets set price in a uniform manner? And the way I'm going to reframe that, I think maybe to help pose it for this panel is, Ferdinand, do you see that greater use of secondary materials? You mentioned you're increasing the use from 25% to 40%, or that's your aim. You're increasingly using them in the interior of the vehicle. Do you see this, realizing greater value in automotive markets, or what are the price signals that you're seeing from this activity? I think that's a fair way to frame it.
Yeah. So at the moment, it's depending on the situation or the market situation. So sometimes secondary material is cheaper. Is that what you mean? And sometimes it's more expensive compared to primary material. So you can't say that always secondary or primary material is cheaper or more expensive. And at the end, so I'm convinced that maybe in a few years, secondary material, of course, is cheaper, because the cost for extraction of primary material increases year by year because of the limited resources. And therefore, at the end, the best and the most efficient and effective way to save costs is to focus on these secondary materials.
Thank you.
Is that what you mean, or?
Yeah, I think that's it's a fair answer and a good starting point. And any last comments quickly in 30 seconds from either Sarah or Jerome, because I'm noting we are at time.
I can relate to what Ferdinand is saying. I see that in many projects we are handling that, for example, there's a big demand for recycled plastic materials, but there are not a lot of them on the market. So I guess today virgin plastic are still way less expensive, and it's not helping to this. So yeah, just to be a little bit provocative, I think petrol is still too cheap today.
And
that's
okay. Right, and maybe raises some questions back to what we heard earlier around production costs of primary versus secondary materials and where we're seeing support across the system. I'll end there. Thank you for the other questions. And I see there's a bit of a discussion going on in the chat anyways, but thank you to our panelists, Sarah, Ferdinand, and Jerome, and to everybody for feeding into the discussion. We really appreciate it. And at this point, I will pass back to Paul, I think, to transition us over to the breakout sessions.
Yes, thank you very much, Jeff. And
thank you.
To all of the presenters and panel discussions. It certainly set us up for some thought and very well for the breakouts, which I hope everybody will stick around for, which we're going to transition to for the next 35 minutes here. There was a question or a comment made in the chat box earlier around the results of the polls and whether we could share those quickly again before we head off into the breakouts to set up a little bit for the discussion. So Tanzi or Globe, if I could just ask you to share the results from the first poll here. We've got a mix of government, industry, and other participants here, so able to weigh in on market, technology, and policy, which is great. Next poll. So a question around the obstacles for more traceable minerals across the supply chain. So technical barriers around the collection and tracking of that data. Secondly, around the cost of that data collection and management were flagged as sort of the top key barriers to think about. And if we go to the last poll, third poll here, and that's kind of a tied around the supply chain coordination, how we share data, as well as sort of the standardization and transparency issues sort of coming to the top. So something to consider as we head out into the breakouts. And I'm just going to quickly jump to the next slide and give you some sort of breakout rules for engagement here before we do that. So we had a lot of interest in this event. We were able to fortunately give everybody that signed up their preferred breakout room topic. So that's terrific. We have facilitators in each breakout room that'll be guiding the discussion throughout using 3 sort of key questions over the next 35 minutes. We really welcome you obviously to participate. You can unmute yourselves, share your insights and your thoughts in line with the 3 questions. You can also use the chat box if you'd like to provide additional input or share links, for example, that will be captured. I just ask that you please keep your comments brief and to the point and be specific wherever you can. We'll have note takers in each room that will be there to capture the feedback and any links and information shared in the chat box. Obviously be respectful of the opinions and the ideas of others, and that way we encourage you to share openly, challenge ideas, just don't challenge individuals per se. We'll be putting together a summary from all of this, both the plenary and the breakout room conversations, to share back with you afterwards. So we just ask that we follow the Chatham House rules, where you can use what you've learned throughout the session, but please don't attribute those comments to individuals or their organizations outside of this workshop unless they specifically agreed to allow that to happen. So without further delay, I will look forward to seeing some of you in my breakout room.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining back. We have about 30 seconds left, and the rest of the groups will be joining us.
Excellent. Welcome back. Alan, if you're here, I'll pass it back to you for a quick round of reporting out.
Sure, great. Well, it's 2:15 now, and we would like to wrap it up on time at the end of the day, so or as scheduled. So what I think I'm going to do, I'll take the executive decision of getting one from each group, policy, market, and technology to report out. So I'll take it on a first come first served basis. Who from the policy group would like to stand up and report out? Just put up your hand and jump in. Okay, Tansy, you got it.
Hi, Alan. So we were in a great room. We had a mix of government and industry and others involved in the room, so it was quite interesting. What we came up with is sort of immediately, we need standards in Canada to be able to work collaboratively on developing standards around handling devices at the end of their life. And then I would say the bigger theme that came out of it was it's all connected and collaboration is key. So nothing exists in a silo, and it's a policy ecosystem, but it also means that we need economic drivers to ensure that the system is durable. And it also means that it's not at any one level. It's provincial collaboration, but it's also across the federal level and then further out internationally as well. So excellent, trade policy that's effective and collaborative is key. And then the final piece we had was around consumers and the role of consumers in the ecosystem, as well as linked into that economic point.
And specifically, the key theme was around end of life. In particular, it was a high priority area.
Yeah, that was one that arose for sure.
Okay, great. I want to reassure people that we are going to get all of the thoughts through the note takers, synthesized together. There's a lot more than we can possibly cover off in this small wrap-up period of time. And so between the whiteboards, and I just should flag now, there is a mural board section that is for final thoughts. So if you have burning insights or questions or suggestions, please go to the Miro board, and there is a whole panel there for next steps. So I'll encourage you to take that. But for now, we'll just look for the highlights. So
Alan, could I just ask, so our group came up with slightly different policy or distinct policy ones. So could you give Sonia 30 seconds to?
Absolutely, dive in. This is a free marketplace.
Okay, so I think one of the big things that our group discussed was the sort of definition of the different roles that voluntary standards and regulators play, and the need to sort of have a very clear idea of what they are, so there isn't a duplication of efforts when it comes to either deciding what data needs to be collected or the actual data collection process. For example, somebody pointed out that in Canada, like labor conditions are really well regulated, so that's not necessarily something that the voluntary standards need to take on. We also talked a little bit about the need for collaboration and having the different interests of different stakeholders being reflected right at the very start when the standards are being developed. That includes the government, industry, academia, civil society, so that there's a strong sort of consensus building process that takes in everyone's interests at the very start. And there was also a little bit discussion about recognizing that different businesses are at different places in terms of their understanding of the circular economy, and the need to recognize that smaller businesses might need more government support to sort of have a more level playing field with the larger players in the market.
Great.
And very last one, if I have just a couple of more seconds, we also talked a little bit about regulatory barriers and how in some cases these barriers might prevent an emerging market from taking shape.
Great, good, thank you. From technology, is there someone who would like to volunteer to provide their summary?
I can give Bruce and Shahid a chance. I've talked a lot already today.
All right, folks, if you going
Shahid, do you want to?
Yeah, sorry, I was just trying to unmute myself. So we had a great conversation, and I'm going to highlight the key themes that we took away. So first, sticking to the note of like the industry's role was the government role. There was agreement that there's a role that both the private sector and the government has to play. However, national and industry standards need to be harmonized. At the end of the day, the industry knows what's best for the industry in terms of data collection and monitoring and assessing, tracking progress. And they will do the best part to raise the ceiling per se, whereas the governments can raise the floor and ensure that there's stringent mandates to enable more buy-in towards more CE transformation. There's also a need for standardization of data collection and monitoring across the supply and value chain. There remains some technical uncertainty with maintaining data integrity, and blockchain was one technology pathway that seemed to be brought up a lot. However, participants noted that blockchain may be a solution, but it doesn't fit, like it's not one size fits all solution. It cannot address other issues with data pertaining to data gathering as well as transparency. Finally, there was also talk about how there's a chain of evidence that already exists within the industry towards monitoring CE. However, this chain of evidence needs to evaluate trade-offs between enabling and also ensuring data privacy. Considering the, I guess, synchronized nature of the whole supply and value chain, any kind of adultering to the data can cause trickle effects across the whole supply and value chain, leading to, I guess, trust issues and whatnot.
Okay, thank you. Yakameen, did you want to add anything that your group said that was different?
What we did start with was a research. If you need to do research in order to find out the supply chain, what obstacles there are, what do you have that will give you investment opportunities, and you need to analyze the market with that. And then what Shahid was saying, we were looking at proprietary information problems. People don't want to share because they don't want the competition to have their information. And that was one thing, because you don't know what they're going to do with it. And then we were looking at some kind of an alliance. Definitely public-private partnerships are very important, but industry alliances will also be very important, and that can help with funding and co-funding. And then overall regulating government body for circular economy will be great.
All right, thank you. I'm going to shift over to the market group now and get one or two reports in there, and then with the time remaining, we can open up. So, someone from the market discussion groups want to provide their input?
You can go.
Okay, go for it.
Yeah, so ultimately we came up with that these changes will be expensive to consumers and they'll often be reluctant to pay. So this can be driven through, solved through government policies like economic incentives or pricing of externalities. And ultimately this will lead to, like, we'll need to scale this up, and ultimately this these concepts will be need to link to change of consumer culture that is more circular, while also integrating the different nodes of the supply chain, like we've been discussing through all these different presentations. And as finally, that government policies can create the movement and innovation, but in the end, it's going to be big companies that will drive most of the momentum for these innovations.
Thank you. Nurul?
Yeah, so what we have understood from the meeting is that there are some initial costs towards transition to circular economy. So funds or grants are particularly important, and open, inclusive, and internationally acceptable standardization is also important. And we also found that there are no real drivers. For example, we need administrative simplification for the standardization. And finally, a pragmatic incremental change is important, and also trade policy support can be helpful.
Great, thank you. Anyone else from any of the groups? We've got another couple of minutes that has a burning issue that wasn't captured here. Again, we're obviously just taking the very top of these issues. We'll give you a more substantive discussion and reporting out. This is our chance for the snappers round. So here's your last chance. Anybody got a thought they'd like to contribute?
Yeah, Alan, I've got just a comment, because the technical group you wouldn't have thought might have dove into market issues, but one of the things that we noted is the cost of development of the tools, the standardization, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of cost there. And one of the things we identified was that if market pricing were such that there were benefits anywhere along the value chain, that might be an important driver for that investment to happen, if one were really concerned that that investment needed to stay out of government and more in the private sector. So they're incentivizing, if you will, that investment in both technology, standardization, and other issues. Could be a market mechanism that would play well with the technology.
Great, thank you. So somewhat reluctantly, I want to draw this to a close and then hand it to Paul for some last next steps discussion. But I think this has been really rich, a really rich discussion. This is the first of many. We deliberately are using this as a seed discussion to inform, policy and future convening opportunities. And I think we've got a number of areas that on alliance and policy and technical priorities that we'll be able to explore with you and hopefully get your feedback from the next round. It was interesting. Somebody in our group said that, we're trying to develop differentiated systems that are less harmful and more valuable. And that's sort of an obvious statement. But in the absence of trusted data, investment will be impossible or inefficient. So this trusted data question is so important because it allows us to make collective decisions and allows us to make decisions with confidence. And so really just simplified and condensed for me the importance of this. We want the systems, but we need to align, under clear sort of information and rules that serve back to impacted communities and serve forward into businesses. And so it's really inspired me to want to dig deeper into this as a foundational question for moving the circularity issues forward. So thanks everyone for your considerable time, effort, and insights and intelligence. We will follow up, and we are really looking forward to future collaborations as we go from this broad overview to a more focused set of solutions and strategies and action areas that will hopefully take us in the road of a roadmap towards circularity in this area. So thanks to the speakers for all the time and energy you put in your preparation, and for all the participants for all that effort. So I'm going to hand it over to Paul just to close us out, and I think we may be doing it spot on time, which is remarkable.
Wonderful. Yes, thank you, Alan and Tansy. If you don't mind throwing the last couple slides up here. Already a thanks around the board for all the partners and speakers, note takers, and obviously all the participants today. Thank you for engaging. Also want to just put out a big thank you again to our sponsors and workshop partners for this event, Metal Tech Alley in particular as well, who has just finished hosting the Industrial Circular Economy Conference for the last few days. That has been a really great insight that ties into a lot of the conversations we've been having here. As Alan mentioned, we'll be putting together a summary report from today's workshop. So you'll receive that by email in the next couple of weeks. So keep an eye open for that. We go to the next slide. I just wanted to flag the major upcoming event in September, where partners here are planning to host an event on the sidelines for the World Circular Economy Forum. on September 15th on circularity in the mining sector. Be sure to keep an eye open for that event, and we'll keep you in the list for that. For those that aren't familiar, the World Circular Economy Forum's a major global event co-hosted by the Government of Canada and the Finnish Innovation Fund, Sitra, that brings nearly 4,000 people together from 150 countries for that virtual event. So last slide. Thanks very much again. This concludes today's virtual workshop. Thanks for your time, and enjoy the rest of your day. Please stay safe. Take care.